So I'll review a few things and pick up with where I left off, if I marked correctly. But we left off with this proverb, 22:14. The mouth of an adulteress is a deep pit. He who is cursed of the Lord will fall into it. So the word mouth there is a figure of speech called a metonymy, where something stands for something else, like when we refer to the President of the United States as the White House announced today, or the Oval Office said, something like that. So the mouth there is a metonymy for, I think, probably seductive speech on behalf of this immoral woman. The word adulteress, literally it's the word strange, which doesn't mean she's a weird woman. It means she is an unfamiliar woman. I think, as I recall the King James, some versions may actually use that terminology, the strange woman, which kind of doesn't give the exact impression. Although neither does adulteress. It's more of a general idea of an immoral woman, not necessarily a married woman. The word pit there was a word for trapping animals. They would dig a pit and put something over it to trap an animal, and that's the word used to describe what this adulterous, immoral woman does. And it's not just a pit. You can fall in a pit, maybe twist your ankle, but this is a deep pit, meaning serious injury, serious spiritual injury can result if you fall into her pit. And a deeper pit, obviously, is harder to get out of. I think of pornography addiction as it relates to that. We have the concept of judgment. So acts of immorality in and of themselves can carry their own judgment, is part of the emphasis of the verse. In other words, we could be plagued by guilt for the rest of our life. It could be detrimental to our children. Our spouse might abandon us. Our reputation in the community, or a disease, all sorts of judgment that are tied in with that particular sin. So it's a brief verse, a warning about adultery or immorality, but Proverbs greatly expands that one verse in a number of other places, for example, and we'll come back to that momentarily. All of chapter 7 is an expanded chapter on that, as well as chapter 5, chapter 2, verses 16 through 19, chapter 6, verses 23 through 35. Proverbs says so much about the subject of sexual immorality. You know, maybe at times kind of an embarrassing topic to talk about, but I'd sure rather talk about it, building the fence at the top of the cliff, than go through the experience that pastors often have to go through of, you know, the couple that's there in his office crying, or the man who's plagued with an addiction to pornography. But the Bible addresses it. In fact, almost every book of the Bible addresses the sin of sexual immorality. So that tells us this is something we ought to be talking about. This is something we ought to be taking seriously, all the more so in our day and age when we've got the media that can make it so much more readily available and so much more of a temptation. Okay, if you'll turn to chapter 7, I made reference to that, and I think that's kind of where we were. I had taken you many weeks ago to chapter 7, which is an expansive story, I think, on that very proverb. And it's talking in particular about the fool who is described as being naive. Look at verses 4 and 5. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your intimate friend, that they may keep you from an adulteress, from the foreigner who flatters with her words. And you remember in the proverb, back in chapter 22, it's the speech that is being emphasized there. So according to verses 4 and 5 here in chapter 7, What is the key to avoiding immorality? What's the key to finding fulfillment in marriage? It's wisdom. Oh, who would have thought? But that's verses 1 through 5, the very emphasis. So if you are, there's plenty of other benefits as well if you're going to be a person of wisdom. But one of those is to be guarded from immorality, and how we need that. Verse 8, passing through the street near her corner, and he takes the way to her house in the twilight, in the evening, in the middle of the night, and in the darkness. By the way, the word naive is there in verse 7, sometimes translated simple. This is the lowest level. Remember, there are different levels of a fool in Proverbs. So that lowest level is just somebody who's just kind of gullible, just not really thinking, we'll try anything once kind of mentality. So that's the person that's being described here. And he is naive. What are you doing, hanging around her house and after dark? Don't put yourself in temptation's way. You're not really thinking there. And I love the statement, if you want to avoid the devil, you'd better stay away from his neighborhood. And how true it is. Now, okay, maybe none of us would hang around the red light district of a big city, or hang around the house of an immoral woman, but we can hang out so readily and easily and secretly of the house of the immoral woman on our internet screen or on our phone. So it's a whole new avenue of application for these words in Proverbs that weren't even applications 20 or so years ago. All right, I think that we'll do just for review. One other thing, verse 10. Behold, a woman comes to meet him dressed as a harlot and cunning of heart. I keep saying this. I got to kick myself that I'm not writing this down. Proverbs keeps giving us clues as to someone's heart. We typically say, well, we can't read somebody's heart, but actually there are a lot of different ways we can read somebody's heart. Now here we can know about this woman's heart by the way she dresses. How interesting is that? A big area is speech. Speech is another key indicator of where someone's heart is. But here it's the dress. So I think that's as far as I had left off weeks ago. So we'll pick up at verse 14. This is the immoral woman speaking. I was due to offer peace offerings today. I'm sorry, that's the wrong verse. Verse 16 is what I wanted. I have spread my couch with coverings, with colored linens of Egypt. I have sprinkled my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us drink our fill of love until morning. Let us delight ourselves with caresses. So clearly a scene of sensuality describing the bedroom here. I have a quote I like from Charles Bridges, an old Puritan, who said, expensive tapestries cannot cover the ugliness of sin, and the most aromatic spices cannot turn the stench of sin into fragrant perfume. Yeah, well said. And that's the fraudulent, destructive lie of sexual immorality, right? It promises big time, right? It promises a thrill. It promises that casual and illicit sex, it will satisfy that deep longing that you have for a mutual commitment. And it's not true. It's the lie of the devil. It promises big and won't fulfill. God's way, of course, is you commit first. You make that commitment in marriage and then enjoy the benefits of sexual intimacy. Verse 19, for my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. He has taken a bag of money with him. At the full moon, he will come home. Her words here almost remind me of teenagers, saying, oh, come on. Are you scared? Nobody's going to find out. Haven't you done this before? It'll be fun. And yet, here she is, a grown woman, but a grown immoral woman. I don't remember who it was, but I remember years and years ago hearing some speaker. I don't even think it was necessarily at a men's conference, but he said, my dear believers, what are you going to do on that day, which most all of us will face, when you have that opportunity to be immoral? You've got the opportunity, the temptation, everything has come together. What will you do? And hopefully that doesn't happen, but it could happen, not even knowingly. You just kind of find yourself, what will you do? Well, this naive man here, he did not do the right thing, did he? So she's using her mouth. We saw that back in 22:14, her seductive speech. Note verse 22, suddenly he follows her as an ox goes to the slaughter. Isn't that a powerful illustration? He thinks he's walking into this room and he's going to enjoy, his fantasy come true, and he's actually like a dumb ox going to be slaughtered. Wow, that's powerful. I wish I could come up with illustrations like that on a regular basis. But he's willingly allowing himself to be led, completely unaware. He's certainly the naive fool. He doesn't understand that he is in for trouble. We're made in God's image. Man and woman, we're the pinnacle of creation. But note what sin does. Sin, particularly even in this case, sexual sin, it drags us down to the level of an animal. That's what Scripture is teaching here. Now, what should he have done instead? He should have been a Joseph, right, from Genesis. Run the other way, even if you leave your coat behind. Don't run and don't look back. No, instead he kind of just meanders into the slaughterhouse. 2 Timothy 2:22, a great verse that says, flee also youthful lusts. Again, it's that aggressive term. You got to be aggressive when it comes to sexual temptation, or you're going to be very vulnerable. You got to almost be fanatical. Joseph seemed fanatical, and yet we preach glowingly about him, and rightly so. Got some great advice here from the father. Remember, Proverbs is kind of the perspective of a father putting his arm around his son and giving him advice and wisdom for successful living. So, verse 24, now therefore, my sons, listen to me and pay attention to the words of my mouth. So these final three verses here in Proverbs 7 are going to give the solution, how you can avoid being this naive individual who is in essence an ox going to the slaughter. First part of verse 25, do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. So what's the first piece of advice? Guard your heart. Literal, physical, sexual immorality never happens until first you've already committed it in your heart. To my knowledge, I've never heard of anybody just waking up one day and saying, today I think I'm going to destroy my family, destroy my ministry, and go out and commit sexual immorality. It doesn't work like that. A person has become careless with the things that they're letting impact their heart, the things that they're watching, people they're hanging around with, things they're reading, all sorts of venues. So the Father has great advice here. Guard your heart. Reminds me of Proverbs 4:23. I think the NASB doesn't use the word guard, as I recall. Yeah, watch over. I mean, that's a legitimate way to translate it. I'm used to the King James. I kind of prefer that. Watch over your heart. Guard your heart with all diligence, and especially as it relates to sexual sin. We just have to be so careful in that regard. So, that means a whole lot of things. Don't be fantasizing. For women, okay, it may be your husband is not giving you the attention you wish that he would, but don't be looking for that attention from the handsome guy in the cubicle next to you at work. Don't be looking for that on the internet from some chat room or whatever it might be. If we're going to guard our heart, sure seems like we got to avoid quite a bit of Hollywood and the media, and soap operas and romance novels and a lot of music and internet and worldly friends and talk shows and magazines. So many of these things are going to impact our heart in a negative way. So guard your heart. And then note the second part of verse 25, do not stray into her paths. So we'll say, guard your steps. So the first one has to do with our heart. Second one has to do with just the literal, tangible, physical things that we do to prevent immorality from happening. In this case, stay away from the area of town where she lives. Today, get a filter on your internet, or get any website you go to, it goes to a third party. Lots of things that are available. It's Romans 13:14. Don't make provision for your flesh. Do everything that you can possibly do to make sexual immorality hard to do. It's so easy to, especially on the internet in this day and age. So you may have an internet filter, but what happens if the internet filter fails? Well, hopefully you're guarding your heart. So at all times, you've got this double wall of protection, guarding your heart, and then doing everything you can to not give yourself an opportunity for immorality to happen. I remember Vice President Pence got ridiculed to no end because he somehow in some interview let it be known that he wouldn't have dinner alone with another woman who's not his wife or not a relative. And the world just really reamed him out over that. But what he was doing was a good thing. He was guarding his steps. Now, technically, there's nothing, I guess, immoral in and of itself being with a woman who's not your wife, but if you always avoid that situation, then you guaranteed you're avoiding immorality. So that's part of the point here in guarding your steps. And then the third would be consider the consequences. That'd be verses 26 and 27. So guard your heart, guard your steps, and consider the consequences. I couldn't get the word guard in the third point there. Sorry about that. For many are the victims she has cast down, and numerous are all her slain. Men, she might be gorgeous, but internally she's a spiritual Hitler. She's a spiritual Saddam Hussein. And this naive fool didn't realize that, and he's going to pay the price. 27, her house is the way to Sheol, descending to the chambers of death. Sheol, that's the Hebrew Old Testament word, and its counterpart in the New Testament would be Hades. And so that describes what we read in Luke 16, I think the second half of that chapter. Remember the rich man and Lazarus in Hades, the two compartments. So they're one and the same. So at least in the Old Testament, righteous and unrighteous people, when they died, went to Hades, went to Sheol, but there were just two different compartments. So what might that be all about? Talking about death. Well, maybe a jealous, angry husband who came home early and discovered what was going on and might have killed him. Might have been possibly a disease, maybe suicide. And let's not forget, the Old Testament law actually prescribed the death penalty for adultery. It wasn't usually carried out, but that's what was supposed to happen. So consider The consequences. Again, I had some speaker say this, or I read it somewhere years and years ago, and it stayed with me. Are you tempted? Do you have this fantasy? All right. What if you actually did that? Think of what your life would be like. What would it do to your ministry? What would it do to your family? If you carried it, what would the people of Parsippany Baptist Church think? And yeah, we got to consider the consequences of our action. What would it do to you spiritually and financially and physically? I don't have to tell you, I don't have to convince you, we live in an immoral society. It encourages, it promotes the basest kind of immorality out there. And we dare not think, oh, this can't happen to me. If it can't happen to me, why does almost every book of the Bible have something to say about sexual immorality? It can happen to us. Don't think you're more godly than David. Don't think you're wiser than Solomon or stronger than Samson. All three of those men blew it as it relates to the subject of sexual immorality. So some good teaching there, and that's all the further I'm going to take it. Though I mentioned chapter 5 also is on the subject, and a few verses in chapter 6 as well. So important. And, I feel for parents. Rachel and I face that a little bit, but I think even more now in this era, parents are forced to have to deal and teach their kids things that it's just sad because it's so prominent in our culture. And you would wish that, I wish I didn't have to address that with my kids until they were older, but you as a parent want your kids to hear it from you and not from their friends or from someone on the internet. All right, got a few minutes. Come back to Proverbs 22. I'll introduce the next verse. Wow, this chapter is just filled with all sorts of great stuff on borrowing and sexual immorality and child rearing and now spanking. So we've got a lot of neat topics that I just can't resist, taking a little extra time. But here's verse 15 of chapter 22. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline will remove it far from him. Just some general things to begin, and we won't have a chance to get to the practical matters of spanking. But note what we learn from this verse, that becoming wise is not automatic, right? That's not what happens. What is our default setting? Seems like I've been using that word default a lot. Our default setting is foolishness, according to this verse. We're all born fools. And unless we submit ourselves to the discipline of wisdom, we just become better and better fools. We become more and more useless as a servant of the Lord, unless we're going to make a conscious effort to be wise and learn wisdom. And that's sad. We expect that from the world, but kind of sad when we think of believers who seem to not have much wisdom at all and seem to have wasted a lot of years of their Christian life. Of course, foolishness, kind of a subcategory of the broader term of total depravity, where mankind is. We've gone over this a little bit. There are different types of fools. Actually, I think 5 different key words. Now, the first one and the last one are very easy to delineate. I've already mentioned the naive or the simple. That just means kind of open, gullible. And then the very worst kind of fool is the scorner or the scoffer. And I think we already covered that verse. Our response to the scoffer is to cast him out. There's really no hope. But then we've got three different words, and I'm still struggling with, is it 2, 3, and 4, or is it 2, 4, how we arrange those. But so those three words, one of those words is the word that's used here in verse 15. That surprised me. I would have assumed, talking about child, we're referring to this lower level, but no, it's actually this kind of mid-level of foolishness. So simple, I've got some information here. The budding fool, open wide, is what the Hebrew word means. Willing to try anything once. Vulnerable, no discernment, gullible. And then these three middle words mean slow, but not in mental capacity. Slow in willingness to obey, just this inclination to make wrong decisions and to choose wrongly over and over. And then the scorner, he's deliberate. He's not content to be evil himself, but has to get others to join in with him. He absolutely hates rebuke. There's another signal of somebody's level of maturity. How do they respond to correction? The scorner, he'll hate you if you try to correct him. So the measure of how much a fool a person remains is determined by your response to instruction and correction. That's so important. Your response to correction and instruction. So parents, especially teachers, experienced teachers, probably can tell early on, this child just does not respond to instruction and correction. And that's a sad scenario because you know biblically where that path is going to head. Well, I thought children were a clean slate. I thought they were pure. I thought they were innocent. If we could just keep them in a perfect environment, everything will be okay. Well, no, that's not the case. They are fools by nature, and they have a sin nature that is a part of their being. So a child's problem is not an information deficit. A child's problem is not, well, it's just a phase. I've heard that so often. A parent just completely oblivious to their rebellious child, and they just, it's just a phase. Oh yeah, it's a phase. It's a phase that'll only get worse if you don't intervene and deal with it. And a lot of times parents who have had a degree of success in rearing their children will have parents say, wow, you must be nice to have had such compliant children. And every parent, no matter how compliant your child was, still it was a child where foolishness was bound up, and there still needed to be work that was done. And the moment you relax and say, all right, then you got to come back to another area that has reared its ugly head. So the sin nature, it's going to impart a self-centered attitude, and that leads children just to do what comes naturally and do what they feel like doing without consideration for others. I don't know if you've heard of this. I don't know if it's still popular, but I remember 20 years ago or so, all of a sudden we had this new psychological disorder, ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. And if you have any four of the following, you have this dreaded disease. Number one, loses his temper. 2, argues. 3, refuses to comply with adults' requests. 4, annoys people. 5, blames others for his mistakes or misbehavior. 6, touchy or easily annoyed by others. 7, spiteful or vindictive. And number 8, angry. That's not a disease, right? That's just evidence of a sin nature and foolishness that's bound up in the heart. And we have such a benefit as believers to have God's Word to help us to understand anthropology. We understand what human beings are like. Okay, let me make a note, and we will stop there and come back to next week and talk about spanking. That'll be a lot of fun. Maybe we can all share some stories. Now, we don't necessarily want to share stories unless you think it's appropriate and wouldn't in any way reflect negatively on those who spanked you. Okay.